All right. Well, let us get started. First of all, I would like to express our land acknowledgement. We acknowledge the responsibility to care for the lands in which we are situated in the Treaty 7 region of southern Alberta, which includes the Blackfoot Confederacy, including the Siksika, Piikani, Kainai, and Tsuut'ina First Nation, and the Stoney Nakoda Nation, including the Chiniki, Bearspaw, and Wesley First Nations. Calgary is also home to the Métis Nation of Alberta, Region 3. I would also like to, it's my pleasure as Numata Chair in Buddhist Studies, Wendy Adamek, to invite Dr. Douglas Duckworth as the 2021 Kawamura Memorial Speaker. And about the Kawamura Speaker Series, it was established after Leslie S. Kawamura's passing in 2011, and it honors his memory. Dr. Kawamura was a minister in the Jodo Shinshu tradition and a scholar of Yogacara Buddhism, and I imagine he would have really enjoyed today's seminar and tomorrow night's lecture. He was a faculty member in the Department of Religious Studies at the University of Calgary from 1976 until his death, and from 2008 onward was a chairholder of the Numata Chair in Buddhist Studies, which he inaugurated in 1987. Now, our speaker today, Dr. Douglas Duckworth, has his PhD from the University of Virginia, is a professor at Temple University, and has many papers on Buddhist thought and cross-cultural philosophy that have appeared in numerous prestigious journals and books. He has authored and collaborated on an impressive array of projects. His previous books include Mipam on Buddha Nature, The Ground of the Nyingma Tradition, another book, Jamgol Mipam, His Life and Teachings, and he also introduced and translated Distinguishing the Views and Philosophies, Illuminating Emptiness in a 20th Century Tibetan Buddhist Classic. He is co-author of Dignaga's Investigation of the Precept, A Philosophical Legacy in India and Tibet. He's co-editor of Buddhist Responses to Religious Diversity, Theravada and Tibetan Perspectives, and he is also co-editor of Readings of Shantideva's Guide to Bodhisattva Practice. His latest works include Tibetan Buddhist Philosophy of Mind and Nature, which is the topic he'll introduce in tomorrow night's talk, and also a translation of an overview of the wisdom chapter of The Way of the Bodhisattva by Kunzang Sonam, entitled The Profound Reality of Interdependence. And he is also this year's recipient of the Tsadra Foundation Distinguished Research Grant in Tibetan Buddhist Studies, which is awarded to scholars who have made significant contributions through their publications, presentations, and projects. This grant will support research, translation, and writing on Tibetan Buddhism. So I would like to welcome our speaker and look forward to his presentations. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Wendy. And I'm sorry I can't join you in person, but it's really nice that we have this technology to do this remotely. And I was fortunate enough to meet Professor Kawamura at a conference. And one of the books that you mentioned, the collaborative book on Dignaga, Investigating the Percept, was dedicated to Professor Kawamura because he worked on the text that we translated, and his work on commentary on that text was part of what initiated the project. So, and his work on Mipam as well was influential to me as a graduate student when I did my dissertation and earlier work on MIPOM. So I'm really happy to have this opportunity to share some of my current work with you. As I mentioned, the book that was dedicated to Professor Kawamura was a collaborative project. So I was a member of a research team, and the work tonight that I want to present was also this largely the same team with a few different members, and I'll say a bit about that, but I wanted to just emphasize, particularly in the humanities, collaboration is very important, and it's I think the products are usually better, and it's more fun, and it tends to be what people do in the natural sciences. And so I think particularly when you have a wide-ranging research team with a lot of people, it's there's a lot you can learn, and ideally the project is going to be a lot better. So my plan is to talk for about 40 minutes. And if you want to raise your hand in the chat, I don't know what's the best way, if what would be the easiest way, but that might be easy, or maybe Wendy can moderate, or someone could moderate the chat, or if you put something up in the chat, I'll try to see it, because I'm going to try to present our current work in this project that's due to be published in October of this year, called Knowing Illusion. And I'm going to share my screen. So hopefully you can see, let's see. If I, let's see, okay, so truth or consequences, a Buddhist debate over epistemology without foundations. So this is, looks to like a 14th, 15th century Buddhist debate in Tibet over how to understand the nature of truth, and how we go about knowing that truth. And I mentioned this is a result of a collaborative project. So other members of my team were Jay Garfield and John Powers, Jose Cabazon, Teshi Tsering, Sonam Tokchut, Thomas Dr. Ryan Conlon. We had quite a big group. Geshe Yeshe Tupke, so Tibetans and Danish, Canadians, and Cubans, and Australia, people around the world. And so that's that cast of characters. And the cast of characters that I'm going to be presenting are from Tibet are Tsongkhapa, who lived in 1347 to 1419, and is the forefather of the Gelug tradition, a very popular tradition in Tibet, the tradition that the Dalai Lama belongs to. And another tradition, the Sakya tradition, and the person of concern is Daktsang Lodsawa. And he critiqued Tsongkhapa And it started this debate that continues to the present day in Tibet. So it's a live debate. And the debate revolves around how to configure Dharmakirti, who was a great Indian scholar of epistemology and yogacara, and Candrakīrti, who was a great scholar of Madhyamaka and became very influential in Tibet, although it doesn't seem to have had such influence in India, whereas Dharmakirti was very influential. And what's interesting about Tibet is that both of these people and their works come into Tibet. So unlike in China, in Japan, or Korea, or through Sri Lanka and the southern traditions, Theravadan traditions, that received the transmission of Buddhism from India much earlier, it's only in Tibet where these two figures come in, and this debate kind of continues to play out. So it's very distinctive about Buddhism in Tibet, how these figures are understood individually and how they seem to interact. And I want to set the scene a bit after introducing these characters. And in light of time, I'm going to make the complex very simple. And then sometimes I might make the simple complex. So I'm looking forward to a discussion after I present this material, because I just got an email today that soon we're going to get the copy edited text for review, and be the last chances to make some changes. And so I'm happy to present this now. So in any case, if we think about this debate and we go rewind and look at early systematizations of Buddhist thought, we can think about the Abhidharma traditions, who were trying to systematize what the Buddha taught in his message. And this notion of finding what is absolutely simple, the nature of the dharmas that constitute the world. So what is it that really substantially exists, as opposed to what is just our cultural projection, or kind of how we think the world exists, but that it doesn't really exist that way. So this notion of finding the content of our actual experience in terms of these dharmas, or that are irreducible. So you break down the world as it appears in terms of persons, selves, tables, chairs, and what are the building blocks of these things? And these dharmas, or these singular properties, are what are seen to constitute the world. Never wholes, but always just the constituent parts. So the wholes are conceptually designated, but the parts are what really constitute this nature. So in that sense, there's one nature. That's what is substantially existent, as opposed to what is just linguistically or conceptually constructed. And then Nāgārjuna, who was the first named Buddhist philosopher, commentator, who famously establishes what gets known as the middle way, or Madhyamaka. And in Madhyamaka, you also have this distinction between how things appear and how they are, in terms of two truths. So rather than asserting that the parts are real but not the wholes, he describes that even the parts depend on the wholes, and the wholes depend on the parts, and there's no ground to be found such that the nature of things is empty. it lacks any true existence or svabhava, but yet it appears in a way dependently. So dependently, things arise dependently. They arise in dependence on each other, and their nature, nothing is found upon looking for its true nature. So including these, and especially these kind of singular entities of that with one nature and dharmas that were set forth in the Abhidharma tradition. So we go from 1 to 2, and then lastly to 3 with the Yogacara tradition, 3 natures. And there's a lot of different ways, these 3 natures get understood, but in short, again, to kind of make the complex simple, there's a dependent nature of this causal process that's inexpressible, right? Nothing can be said about it. And then when things are said about it, that's the imagined nature. So there's something false about what we say about this inexpressible, dynamic world. And the fact that things are not actually the way we conceive them to be is their consummate nature. And so these three natures are everywhere. Anytime we use some language to describe the world, we impute something on a inexpressible dynamic, and what we're saying about the world is not really how the world is, so it's empty of that. And so these 3 natures refer to themselves in the way that Nāgārjuna's 2 natures, emptiness also refers to itself, so emptiness is empty too. So that's the scene that that the background, some background for the issues that we're going to look at. And then there's an important epistemological turn that happens with Dignaga. And he is famous for reducing all sources of knowledge to 2. So what we perceive directly, and what we perceive is not mixed with language, it's non-linguistic. So we perceive these particulars. And what we conceive and infer is language, is linguistic. And what we infer or conceptualize is not real, or not as real as what we actually directly perceive. But inference provides a source of knowledge, as does perception. And he also famously set forth these rules of inference through which you can classify a valid argument versus something that's an invalid argument. And this really became influential for Buddhists and Indian traditions broadly. He really shaped the structure of logic in India. And then that brings us to Dharmakirti, who saw himself as explicating Dignaga and his system of 2 sources of knowledge, but he wanted to ground knowledge a little in a more stronger grounding than Dignaga. So he modified perception and as kind of being a source of knowledge, it has to be non-deceptive. Not a source of knowledge has to be non-deceptive. And he does this to kind of help ground an epistemology beyond what is just simply coherent, but he wanted a causal connection to the world. And this causal connection was efficacy. So if things have causal efficacy, they have a reality. But this grounding has a price. And this price is this flirtation with foundationalism. That's a kind of foundation for knowledge, and can be at odds with the insight of Madhyamaka or of Nāgārjuna that is undermining all these foundations and emptiness. So that's just more of this setting the scene in these characters. So now, looking at Nāgārjuna, the one who set out these two truths of Madhyamaka, the emptiness of all things and everything being dependent. So there were 4 commentaries on his work in India, and several more across Japan and China and Tibet. Very influential figure, many ways to interpret him. But we're just going to look at 2 really, but in one more in depth. So there's Buddhapālita, who gave the earliest commentary. And notice he's contemporaneous with Dignaga, who develops these rules for logic and proper logical form. And then after Dignaga, there's another commentator, Bhāviveka, who criticizes this earlier commentator for not using the proper logical form. Yes, question.
You said something about UC, which leads me to believe that you are advancing through your slides.
Oh no, you're not bouncing with me?
Mm-mm.
Oh dear.
We're just seeing the title slide.
Oh dear. Okay, let me try this again. I don't know why it's giving me these problems today. Okay, let me just restart this. I apologize for that.
Marika, someone just said that you haven't turned on the presentation.
If I do play from start, and then
it's running in the format where you would create your slides. So when you go down, you can see it going down, but the rest of us can't.
I see. Let me try to share it one more. Let me try this again. And there's one other thing I can do. So do you see the first slide? Do you see the second slide now?
Yes. Okay. Yeah. I didn't realize that. Yeah, I could have flagged it sooner. I'm sorry. I didn't realize that you were running from your slides. Yeah.
Okay. Well, so now you should see the this one, interpreting Nāgārjuna's Madhyamaka. Yeah. Okay. Sorry about that.
Yeah.
No,
that's good. I'm glad we're on the same page. Yeah.
Okay. No, thank you for bringing that to my attention. So if you'll notice that Dignaga intervenes between these 2 commentators, and basically Bhāviveka critiques this first commentator for not using the logical form that became normative or proper. But he was writing around the same time as Dignaga, so it really hadn't been established yet. And Candrakīrti, so he's the last Indian I'll mention before going into Tibet. He critiques Bhāviveka for critiquing Buddhapālita. And so, that'll make sense in a second when I go through their argument. So the first verse of Nāgārjuna's first or most influential text, really spawns a lot of commentary. So in the first verse, it says, not from self, not from other, not from both, not without cause, no entity whatsoever has ever arisen anywhere. So Buddhapālita, when he comments on this verse, namely just the first part, things don't arise from themselves. What does that mean? And he says, entities do not arise from their own natures because their arising would thereby be pointless and absurd. So he puts forward a reductio ad absurdum. So it'd be, you already have the thing, why do you need it to arise? But then Bhāviveka critiques this and said, no, this could lead to confusion. People might think that there is a point, and it's not absurd, and that things arise from their other natures, based on these rules that Dignaga had formulated. So he says the proper way that you should comment on that verse is to use this format of a thesis with a subject and a predicate. So the inner sense fields do not ultimately arise from themselves. And inner sense fields are like the sensory apparatus, like eye organs and ear organs. And why don't they arise from themselves? Because they exist. And then the example is like consciousness. So that's why things don't ultimately arise from themselves. So there's a lot of ink spilt on these on these first verses, and Candrakīrti basically says, well, actually Buddhapālita had it right. You don't need this correction, and the reason why is because there is something distinctive about expressing a contradiction that doesn't commit you to the realism of expressing a probative argument that takes a position and proves it. There's something else that, in a way, performatively enacts the view of emptiness in a way of a skeptical approach that making a thesis does not or does commit you to. So anyway, I need to probably go faster through this to get to what I was hoping to present, but I think this is also a helpful background. And we can, we can discuss if it's unclear. So in any case, in Tibet, what happens is Candrakīrti gets really seen to express a distinctive view on Nāgārjuna that's very important. And this view is what the Tibetans refer to as Prāsaṅgika, which means reductio, or that's what it's, someone who uses reductio ad absurdum arguments. So for every one of these four parts of the tetralemma in Nāgārjuna, what is produced from self, from other, from both, and from neither, or from causelessly, these four get systematized like a consequence expressing contradiction. And this is what Candrakīrti says. He says it absurdly follows that production is pointless because the product is already there. So that for the self-produced, it's already there, so you don't need to produce it. For someone who claims that it's other-produced, a parallel absurd consequence following the same reason, such as it absurdly follows that light arises from darkness. Why? Because it's other. So production from other doesn't work either. And then what about both? Maybe production from self and other. That's question begging, he says, because pointing out that one's reasoning is circular or based on question in response to the claim that things arise from both self and other when neither has been established, neither self nor other, as in the circular logic of something like God is powerful because he is the creator. So it presumes God is the creator, and that's why he's powerful. So it's a circular logic. And these are all drawing from Candrakīrti's comments. He doesn't use this, that's my example, but these other ones are his. And then the last of these is inference acknowledged by others. So say, well, there is causality, but it's just not the type of causality that relies on strong foundations. It's just simply what people do. So what the cowherds do, for instance, or farmers toil in their fields to produce crops. Otherwise no one would go to work, right? No one would farm if there was no causality. So he's denying each of these four in this distinctive way. And in Tibet, this distinctive way gets associated with a distinctive view. And in India, there's a lot of debate about this amongst Indian scholars that no, Candrakīrti, it tends to be that scholars of Indian Buddhism don't seem to accept that this has a real philosophical distinction, but I personally think it does, and along with a lot of Tibetans. Not all Tibetans do either. So it's a debate. I'll leave it up to you too. So Tsongkhapa, who's very influential, he says in his 8 distinguishing features of Prāsaṅgika-Madhyamaka that an autonomous probative argument, something that proves something, is not suitable to generate the view of reality in an opponent. So in a debate, it's not sufficient, and it's not even proper to have an autonomous probative argument. And in the way that Bhāviveka, right, set forth to critique Buddhapālita, and that Candrakīrti comes to, Buddhapālita's defense. So this starts a big debate in Tibet, given Tsongkhapa's other claims about the importance of a strong epistemology in Madhyamaka, that you need to have a clear understanding of the ultimate nature of reality as empty of true existence, as well as a clear understanding of conventional truths, and having a robust epistemology regarding conventional truth, because for Tsongkhapa it's not different. Conventional truth and ultimate truth are not different. So if you make a mistake regarding the conventional, you make a mistake regarding the ultimate, and vice versa. So I don't have time to go into Tsongkhapa, but Daktsang critiques Tsongkhapa and his interpretation of the implications of Candrakīrti's critique in 18 great contradictions. So that's really what the book is about, and exploring the in-between spaces between Daktsang's critique and Tsongkhapa's and his students' responses. And it really sparks up an ongoing debate that continues to the present day. So to summarize Daktsang's 18 points, these are, rather than going through all 18, I'll give you a sample, but just to summarize. So 1, the notion of warrant cannot be separated from foundationalism, and the Prāsaṅgika system is anti-foundational. So the idea of a warrant, or something that kind of gives you access to true reality, even perception, is foundationalist. And the Prāsaṅgika system is questioning all foundations, so you can't just say that. You can't appeal to any warrants and be a good Prāsaṅgika. Secondly, no claim or position withstands analysis, and so any expression of knowledge can be exposed as false. So again, this is that strong skeptical current. So no probative argument that's proving or asserting something is accepted. Every time you open your mouth about the ultimate reality, you're wrong in some fundamental sense. For Daktsang, not the case for Tsongkhapa, of course. 3, to take any set of faculties as warranting is arbitrary, and so no epistemic or cognitive faculties can be warranted. So any source of knowledge, be it the eye or the nose or the ears or the mind, presupposes a known object. And so this duality that's built into the structure does not, and saying that we grant priority to vision, for instance, above hearing, or the mind, rationalism above empiricism, it's just arbitrary. So nothing has a solid, there's no bedrock foundations. And lastly, knowledge entails being correct about the object of knowledge. We are always mistaken in some respect about any object. So it's a radical type of position, rather, given that it's a self-undermining position, but that everything that we know and can know is somehow mistaken, at least for sentient beings. So that's this critique. And I want to give a couple examples from his text, and then make some conclusions, and then open up for discussion, questions. So I mentioned he has 18 points that present contradiction in Tsongkhapa. So I started with point 3 just because I thought it might be easier. So he says the presence of inference contradicts the absence of probative arguments. So each of the 18 contradictions in the first part is something that Tsongkhapa accepts, and the second part is something that he also accepts, but he seemed to be in contradiction. So Tsongkhapa accepts inference is fine, but not these, at least autonomous probative arguments, proving something. So for Daktsang, they rise and fall together. So you can't have, either you have them both, they're both legitimate forms of knowledge, or they're both not. The second one, the absence of shared perception contradicts the logical subject being epistemically warranted. This is a big topic, but basically, in an argument, like according to Dignaga's rules, such that the sense fields are ultimately do not arise from themselves because they exist like consciousness. So the idea that there are things that are shared amongst people, a shared logical subject becomes a problem. And Candrakīrti refutes this idea that people have different cultural baggage and different perspectives on things. So this idea that that we have a shared perception is commits you to a realist view, and thus the fact that this is denied then flies in the face of wanting to have some logical subject being epistemically warranted, meaning that it has a source of knowledge that it can ground it in a foundational truth. And so Daktsang sees that as a contradiction with Tsongkhapa. I'm going to go through these fairly quickly, but just to give you a taste of the flavor, all objects being false contradicts their subjects being undeceived. So Tsongkhapa agrees with the Madhyamakas that everything that appears, appears in a way that, at least for a non-Buddha, appears in a way that conflicts with its mode of reality, because it appears to exist intrinsically, but yet it lacks intrinsic existence. So, but Tsongkhapa also wants to, for some epistemology, some source of knowledge that is non-deceptive. So again, this non-deceptive language, coming from Dharmakirti. So he says, well, this is a contradiction, because if it's false, it's false. You can't be undeceived about what is false. And that's his first of the 18. And the second is related to that, like being mistaken about an object contradicts being an epistemic warrant for it. So if you make a mistake about something, how can you be right about it too? How can you be a reliable source of knowledge for that thing? Because Madhyamakas will say you're necessarily, and Tsongkhapa, you're necessarily mistaking about what appears to your mind, and things appear in a way that they exist intrinsically, but they don't. So how can you be? How can anything in our experience, even our sense perceptions, be reliable sources of knowledge? And then the last two that I'm going to raise before drawing some conclusions. So that the 6 types of beings each have their respective epistemic instruments contradicts the position that physical matter is epistemically warranted. So the 6 types of beings refers to the beings in the desire realm. So hell beings and hungry ghosts and animals and demigods and gods and humans. So when they see water, like in Vasubandhu, mentions that when different beings see water, they see it differently. Some, fish will see it as a place to live. Hell beings supposedly see it as, molten iron, and hungry ghosts see it as pus and blood, and gods see it as nectar. So given this kind of perspectivalism, and then how can we say that we're perceiving water correctly? Because that's an important part of the Tsongkhapa system. If he wants to say that, oh, this is a mirage, while this is water. But if you make that distinction, this is waking reality, this is dream reality. If you make that distinction, are you committed then to foundationalism? That's part of the heart of this debate. Another example might be, we might say, he won the video game. But the video game is just a bunch of points of light or pixels on the screen. And so a winner and loser is just simply a cultural product of, the way we organize light, points of light on a screen and construct a narrative around a normativity around points of light in our visual field. So it's also part of this tension that is there more of a ground of reality that is the points of light? Do they somehow have a more reality than this other layer of just images or players on the screen, or are they all just equally conceptual constructions? Is there a way that something can be like more right on one level or more real on one level and less real on another? Or is knowledge something that's across the board false? So that's another issue that these topics that are in play with these contradictions. In any case, just the last one I want to raise. So the non-existence of floating hairs contradicts the existence of the river of pus. So I mentioned that the river of pus is an example that Vasubandhu uses for what hungry ghosts see that we see as water. And so Tsongkhapa and his tradition, they want to have like, well, there is kind of epistemology for hungry ghosts and for hell beings. There's a right way for hell beings to see the water or the molten iron. There's a right way for humans to see it. There's a right way for gods to see it as nectar. But it's wrong for humans to see it as a mirage. So he said, well, that doesn't make sense. It's all it's subjective, let's say. It's all just constructed. And Tsongkhapa wants to make he wants to make a distinction between floating hairs. Like if someone has an eye disorder, they might see floaters or have an hallucination of something or a dream vision versus a waking state. So he wants to have a distinction between these. But he says that these don't exist and these do, whereas the river of pus does not exist, but a water does for humans, but there's a tension there in terms of what, who gets it right? Or does everyone get it wrong? Is it only the Buddha that gets it right? And what does it mean to get it right? So these are all questions that these contradictions raise. Unfortunately, I don't have answers for you, or for better or for worse, answers to these questions. Hopefully some of this makes some sense. So what I'm calling the anti-realist dilemma is this dilemma between anti-realism, where all there is a coherent picture of the world, but it's not really connected to any foundations, right? So we can contrast foundationalism about knowledge, where there's a bedrock foundation like Descartes. He's trying to question everything, but start with something basic, like I think, therefore I am. And so you can start with this, a self, if you want. And Buddhists would, of course, critique that, that you haven't gone far enough, Descartes. But, I think, therefore I am, some basic, or I think, therefore something is happening, right? So some basic, undeniable fact, and then build upon that from a solid foundation to create, through perception or self-awareness, perhaps, as a basic feature of knowledge and building from that, and perception tends to be what people use, particularly, sense data in the 20th century. We have sense data theorists like Russell, and we have these type of Abhidharma theories of just kind of getting at the raw phenomenal colors and shapes, and not really accepting tables and chairs or extended objects in our ontology. But is there a middle way between kind of having genuine knowledge about the world and having it? Does that mean that you're a foundationalist, that you accept kind of true reality in some sense, which is explicitly denied by people like Candrakīrti? Yet, but if you don't have genuine knowledge, all you have is a coherentism, like a coherent picture of the world that really doesn't correspond to anything in the world. It just coheres. Like the example, as opposed to a bedrock for knowledge, an example that Quine draws upon, the raft. Like all we have is like a raft floating around, and we're on that raft, and we can kind of configure the wood on the raft in different ways, but we don't have any bedrocks to kind of build from. And it's more like kind of reeds of straw leaning up against each other, like a pyramid of straw that just each one holds up the other. And so it's our collective practices, our language holds up the world, but it's not grounded in any true foundations or essence. But does that mean relativism, a pernicious type of net relativism? So this debate between, on the one hand, Dharmakirti and the tradition he represents from Dignaga and Candrakīrti gets played out in Tibet between Tsongkhapa and Daktsang. And Daktsang accuses Tsongkhapa about being a realist about the conventional world, because he insists on having a genuine epistemology in terms of distinguishing right and wrong, distinguishing illusion from what is real, at least conventionally real. And whereas the other side, in response to Daktsang's critiques, the Gelug tradition will respond by saying, well, Daktsang, if you don't have any criteria for distinguishing between things, a mirage and a lake, or you can't say who won the video game, then is that not relativism and become nihilism about the conventional world? So that's what I see as this kind of anti-realist dilemma. It's a debate between anti-foundationalism, knowledge without real foundations, but where is there a place for knowledge? And both Tsongkhapa and Daktsang have very unique ways of reconciling these. They both bite bullets in different ways, because there's no, I would argue, perfect resolution. There's kind of an embedded tension here. And what's, for me, the issues at stake have really become more clear by looking in the spaces between this debate and dialogue, because often there's a lot of straw manning done, and this person is just a relativist. Forget about, they can't tell the difference between a dog and an ice cream sandwich. Or, they don't have any source of knowledge. Whereas the other one is like, well, it must be, they must be realists because they do have such an account, and there's all these problems that come. So there's a lot of misrepresentation in terms of, in their debates, sometimes straw manning happens, but at the same time, there's a lot of really careful philosophical care that's taken to arguments. And, I think this, to me, it really represents an important tension within Buddhist theory of knowledge and what it means to what the two truths mean, and I see the middle way as somewhere in between these two extremes. But I've said a lot. I've simplified things. I've glossed over things. Maybe made things sometimes more complex than they need to. I wasn't sure of everyone's background, so I tried to do my best. But you probably have questions, I hope, and I'm happy to talk about some of this. And this book is supposed to come out it's in 2 volumes. We have a translation volume where it looks at the texts that constitute the debate across several centuries, as well as a study volume that looks at the background, the history, and the philosophy of these positions. So thank you for listening.
Great. Well, thank you so much. Yeah, this is really fascinating, and I've been dragging my students through some of this material, so hopefully they'll feel emboldened to speak up. But we have a question from Lu Huang. So Lu Huang, if you want to unmute yourself and speak, then.
Yeah, thank you, Professor. I have a question. How does Tsongkhapa choose this standard for his foundation of knowledge? Like Dhammakirti also has his own standard. For example, he chooses self-awareness to be his foundation. But it seems that Tsongkhapa chooses a foundation that is less fancy than Dhammakirti. I'm thinking about because his stance is Prāsaṅgika-Madhyamaka, and he should be more likely to reject the realist view than anyone. But oppositely, he chooses a realist view in his ontology, and he chooses this ground that seems not as fancy like something like Yuktara's self-awareness. So I'm wondering why. What is his standard? Thank you.
Okay, that's a great question. And there's a lot to say about it. So I should have mentioned that Tsongkhapa says, if you don't understand Prāsaṅgika-Madhyamaka, then you don't get liberated. And it's a radically different view than Yogacara, and even a radically different view from Swatantrika-Madhyamaka, which is the alternative that Bhāviveka set forth, in a probative argument or an autonomous probative argument. So he makes a really strong claim that you have to understand Prāsaṅgika to achieve nirvana. I wouldn't say that he chooses a realist ontology. Of course, he's accused of that, but he says that nothing has intrinsic nature. So some people will accuse him, another Sakya, Gorampa, who's more popular than Daktsang, he will say that Tsongkhapa is actually a nihilist regarding the ultimate truth, because he accepts that it's an absence of intrinsic nature. But he's a realist regarding the conventional truth, because there's the danger that things just remain the same simply without the added layer of intrinsic nature. So there's this danger that haunts Candrakīrti and Tsongkhapa, what's been called by Tom Tillemans the dismal slough, which basically is leaving the status quo in place. Because if you just critique the ultimate nature of things and you leave the conventions alone, like the mountains are again mountains and the rivers are rivers, after going through the study of Zen, where mountains are no longer mountains and rivers are no longer rivers, if you leave them in the first context, if they just come back to the first pre-Zen context, you've done nothing. And so there's that threat, there's that danger. But I thought that someone might ask for, when I was hoping, so thank you, someone might ask. So I've left my screen up there, the PowerPoint, and there's actually a criteria, very important criteria for Tsongkhapa on how he is not a realist regarding the conventional. I mean, I actually think that he can be interpreted as a realist. He does have moments where he tends towards realism, but it's not necessarily the case. So for ultimate, I mentioned for ultimate truth, it's always the emptiness of intrinsic nature. Nothing has intrinsic in nature. So it's a mere absence. And that's in some ways simple, at least deceptively simple. Conventional truth is quite different, but yet in the sense that it's not deceptively simple. But in any case, so he has three criteria. One is it's acknowledged by a conventional cognition. So to be a lake and not a mirage, it has to have some intersubjective worldly backing. Like, so the world has to call it a lake and not a mirage. So there has to be some consensus about it. But notice that that's not necessarily realist, right? There's just consensus. So he's acknowledged by even the cowherds. So that's a phrase that Candrakīrti uses, that even the cowherds will understand. And this is actually important for Tsongkhapa because he doesn't appeal to any type of special theory. Like you mentioned, self-awareness, like Dignaga, it's very important for Dignaga, self-awareness, and Dharmakirti as a means to ground, at least for Dharmakirti, to ground perception and provide a foundation, arguably, for knowledge. And other types of grounds in the Yogacara tradition, like the alaya vijnana, the storehouse consciousness or the basic consciousness, serves as a ground. But Tsongkhapa does not want that ground. And nor does he want, I mentioned the three natures and Vasubandhu, this dependent nature, the Paratantra. So he rejects all grounds and in all like theories about conventional truth that take us further away from conventional truth, right? So they don't give you a better theory of it, and including Abhidharma. They just give you a different theory. So there's no getting necessarily any more true in a sense, according to the first criteria. But now the second criteria, there is a way to revise the conventional truth. And this is where it gets tricky. So the second criteria is not undermined by another conventional epistemic instrument, knowing it to be that way. So you might say, well, that's a lake because I saw it, and then I went there and I drank water. And so I know it's not a mirage. So it was undermined. The mirage was undermined by the lake kind of knowing it to be a lake. And then you might wake up, right? You might say, oh, that was a dream. And so that was undermined by yet another conventional analysis. Oh, I was actually dreaming that I saw the mirage and that I drank the water from, so that's fine because it was undermined. So the conventional is not static and final. It's revisable. And I think this is often overlooked in amongst people, and also within and without of the tradition. There's a tendency to want to hold on to kind of a real solid foundation for conventions, and even with Dharmakirti as well, despite the fact that he holds a strong, robust epistemology and privileges perception as with particular force. He says that these perceptions only work as a source of knowledge as long as samsara is in place. They're not really final and ultimate. So despite being called a foundationalist, at the end of the day, even Dharmakirti, it has a context where he wants to, go beyond this notion of pramāṇa, or source of knowledge, epistemology, because epistemology embeds this dualistic structure of knower and known. And he will eventually want to do away with that too, arguably. And arguably, Tsongkhapa has the resources to do this in his second criteria. So the fact that it can be revised, so if we come up with a better theory later, we can revise it. But there is this tension between 1 and 2, right? So 1 is convention. So how do you reform the world when your world is just intersubjectively constituted? That is a challenge. So there is a certain conservative tendency with the first, and a revolutionary or a revisionary tendency in the second. And how are those? The interplay of those are another dialectic, perhaps another kind of tension that. And then, but lastly, the third criteria is not undermined by reason that correctly analyzes its ontological reality, that is, whether it intrinsically exists or not. So this is another way of saying that just because something's empty and lacks any determinate intrinsic essence doesn't mean that it just goes away. Things can be, things can and are contingent, and that doesn't stop them from happening. So you can say that there is no essence to gender, or that gender is performative, but it doesn't stop gender from happening. It still happens, or you can say that it lacks any. There is no intrinsically existent male or female, but it doesn't stop the conventional consensus, and the fact that this consensus can be revised by another conventional epistemic instrument that knows it to be that way. So this is how I think he's not realist. He appeals to intersubjectivity. He allows for revision, but there's certainly that strong pull towards realism with this first one. But this first one is also important because it keeps him grounded in the world that is constituted intersubjectively and publicly, socially constructed world that doesn't appeal to any kind of foundation beyond that construction. And that's an important part of his Prāsaṅgika position, that there are no intrinsic natures, even conventional. Nothing exists independently, even conventional. So he says that's what distinguishes Prāsaṅgika from non-Prāsaṅgika. Others want to bracket the convention. Well, ultimately it's like this. Ultimately it's empty, but conventionally it could be however you want it, like Yogacara or Sautrantika or Abhidharma. But he says no. The two truths are actually not distinct. A mistake in the convention is a mistake in the ultimate. A mistake in the ultimate is a mistake during the convention. These things are not separate, and they're not really separate. So anyway, I hope that answers your question, or maybe.
Yeah, thank you. Can I follow up? Because
Sure, yeah. And I have another question in the chat, but yes, please do follow up.
sorry.
We still have time.
Sorry.
No, not at all. We still have time. Yeah, no, it's good. Go ahead.
Yeah, I have a weird thought because it seems that I used to think it is the Yogacarans who criticize Madhyamakas to be nihilist. But it seems here that from Tsongkhapa's point of view, Yogacara, from the overemphasis of the perspectivalism and the overemphasis on how to ground this truth in something that is unconnected or unrelated to the conventional reality, actually leads to another kind of nihilism, like from the Madhyamaka point of view, and this kind of asymmetrical point of three truths actually leads to nihilism instead of like the other way around. I used to think it is the Yogacara who have the best position to criticize Madhyamaka for nihilism, but it seems here that it is the opposite. Thank you.
Okay, no, great observation. So yes, you are right in, well, I'm not, here's how I'll respond that. So yes, Yogacara, Yogacharans like Asanga and others, have criticized Madhyamaka for being nihilist, and certainly people have criticized Madhyamakans and Tsongkhapa as being nihilist, particularly regarding the ultimate, that there is no there, right? So there's just he consistently emphasizes is the absence of intrinsic nature, full stop. And then being a realist, alternatively, regarding the conventional. Whereas the Madhyamakas critique the Yogacarans just the opposite way, right? So that there is like a big mind or a non-dual mind that continues, the Buddha mind that continues as the non-dual realization of the world. And that's a metaphysical reality. And so that is seen to be realist regarding the ultimate, but yet all things are like a dream in the conventional world, and everything is mind only or only construction. And so then being nihilist regarding the conventional world. So you're exactly right that they're inverted. But what's unique about Prāsaṅgika-Madhyamaka is the asymmetry is the target of analysis. So the asymmetry between what is better, the ultimate truth or the conventional truth, or the conventional truth or the ultimate truth, what is better, mind or emptiness, what is better, neither are better, and once you've made that, you've built in that structure, dualistic structure, you're committed to it, and it's like what's sometimes get called a logic of domination, right? So you've committed structurally, you're bought into this dualistic logic, and it's a logic, and maybe you've inverted the logic of domination. Maybe you've said now that body over mind rather than mind over body, or but you're just bought into it. And but Prāsaṅgika-Madhyamaka wants to just collapse these hierarchies into this radical, and I would say performative, non-duality, and that's that's what I find very unique about Prāsaṅgika. And so it's not explicit. And to go back to the point that I want to make is that Prāsaṅgika does give a unique view. But it's not a view that can be stated. It has to be shown or performed. And that's why I think it's so difficult for people to appreciate it. And and particularly people that are doing textual scholarship on, Sanskrit texts, in particular, that tends to be most people that work on Indian materials alone and not the Tibetan materials think, in my experience at least, that it's just a formal distinction. It's not a real distinction. And of course there's people in Tibet that think that too, but I do think it's something more than just a formal distinction in the form of the argument. There is a dimension that is a critique of asymmetries between two truths. It's a way of expressing and relating to meaning that can't be expressed, but it can only be performed. It can only be shown. And so it's a non-denotative meaning that, and it's often appealed to as, it's a constant pulling the rug out one way. That's one way it's performed, but it is something distinctive, I would argue.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you so much. And I would like to get back to this performativity issue, but trying to capture the question of one of our graduate students before he needs to leave. Gabrielle's question, I'll read it out. Thanks for the talk. Mine is really a very approximative and generic question or comment. Given what you recalled at the beginning about the nature of language, what are your thoughts on the correspondence between the various levels of denial of independent existence and the overwhelmingly negational language used by philosophers and commentators? Examples like non-existence, contradiction, lots of negational prefixes. I find it interesting to observe nihilistic or quasi-nihilistic arguments being expressed in non-affirmative ways as a reflection of subject matter and aims on the language used, while at the same time necessarily attributing a linguistic reality, possibly pointing to a reification of the negation itself. Feel free to point out the probably many wrong points in my message. So I think we've got this sort of emptiness of emptiness question hovering in the air, but yeah.
Okay, thank you. I'm very happy for that question because also it gives me a chance to balance off the, I was anticipating, can you see the Daktsang's three contexts?
Yes.
Shared screen. Okay, so I think this relates to your question, and if it doesn't, please follow up. I know you have to leave, but this relates to this issue. So the way Daktsang describes Madhyamaka is in three distinct contexts. And he calls them the context of no analysis, slight analysis, and thorough analysis. So no analysis is basically the level of worldly truths. So that's just how people talk and go about in the world. But it even includes, like bodhisattva levels and even Buddhahood. So it's all, the world is quite large, but they're all truths about the world. And then slight analysis, this is the domain of negation, in the first sense you were talking about. So then, and I think ontological, it helps to insert that parenthetically. So it's slight ontological analysis, whereas anything that we talk about is empty. It lacks any determinate fixed referent. Things are contingent, they're constructed, they lack any kind of clearly definable, demarcated intrinsic natures. And so this is the level of the two truths. So you can say ultimately they're empty and conventionally they're as they are, it's and there is this hierarchy there between, emptiness is ultimate as opposed to everything else that we talked about and approach. But what's unique then about Daktsang is he has a third level. So this third level is not accepted by Tsongkhapa. Tsongkhapa wants to maintain this tension between the conventional and the ultimate, and the kind of put them in this asymmetrical way. He says they're essentially the same, but they're just conceptually distinct. So they're essentially the same. That's an important point of his position. But for Daktsang, the key point then is this third context, where even to say that things are empty is presuming that there is something that's non-empty, right? So even to say that things are empty presumes there is something that is contrasted with emptiness, such that there's the non-empty, so therefore there's an empty. If there's no non-empty, then how could there be empty? Anything empty? Nāgārjuna says this. So in this kind of thorough analysis, it's a radical stance, such that nothing can be adequately said, not even emptiness. So it's beyond negation. So there's really nothing that can be said about it. And this is this performative context, to tie this in also to the performativity, that is just this radical denial of any formula, or even the system itself collapses. And it's a really important part of this system, that it embeds the deconstruction of itself. This is the message of Prāsaṅgika-Madhyamaka, and how it's distinctive from other forms. This is the content of samadhi, or meditation. This is the content of the Buddha mind. There's literally nothing you can say about it. Anything you say is wrong. And it's an important context in Daktsang's framing of the middle way. And so a lot of this debate kind of often they debate the other tradition based on the terms of their own system. And so often these people who respond to Daktsang's critique, or critique his critique, will fail to acknowledge this third context, or presume that he, that in this first context, how does he delineate between, right, the dream and the waking state? Because it's no analysis. So therefore, is that not pernicious relativism, that anything goes? And so there's this kind of pushback at certain points that seem to be legitimate, and then other pushback against failure to acknowledge other points, like this third context. But I think this negation is certainly very important. At Tsongkhapa, in particular, he really emphasizes the ultimate truth should be understood as a non-implicative negation. That means that there's nothing appears to the mind beyond the negation, as opposed to an implicative negation, which is like a non-human animal, for instance. So it still can have a positive referent, right? So it's the non-human, as opposed to there is no human. It's just absent. And so this relates to how the no self is interpreted. Like, is it a selfless, you can say selfless world, and then that the selfless can refer to something. But he's careful to say, no, it has to be, there is no self in the eliminative sense. In any case, there's a lot to say about, I'm not sure if I addressed your question adequately, but those are some thoughts that came up, related in particular to the way negation is described by these two people. And I should say also Dignaga going back to, he set the parameters for epistemology in India and for inference and rules of logical form, and his theory of language is based on negative reference, because there can be no real universals, right? There can be no kind of nothing real is extended in time or space, right? Everything is momentary, and anything that or language always constructs wholes out of a flow of multiple parts, a manifold. And so the way that language gets its traction is he developed this linguistic theory of apoha, which is a theory of negative reference. So when we say cow, the way it works, since there are no real cows, universals in the world, it's through excluding what is the non-cow. So it's by excluding non-cows that we get at cows. So anyway, there's a lot of debate about that. It's a big topic, but again, it just shows the importance of negation in these traditions. So it's a great question, great comment.
Yeah. Thank you for expanding on that, and thank you again for the talk.
Thank you. I see another.
Tanu, yeah.
Yeah, thanks so much for the talk. And my question really is coming from a lot of ignorance, so I apologize for that at the outset. But I'm curious about whether there is discussion about perspectivalism or perspective in the solutions given. It seems to me perspective is part of the problem here. And there's no discussion about qualified predication like you see in, for instance, Jainism or even in the Nyaya, even though they differ in the way they do it. That qualified predication, which allows for perspective in the solution, as it were, of these problems, I think means that perspective is not part of the problematic, but is part of the solution, because perception is itself sort of perspectivalized. And that, in that sense, what I'm trying to say is that I think perspective kind of goes deeper down. Whereas if I'm understanding your point that you might have a shared perspective or shared perceptions of something, and then you've got various different conceptual interpretations and stories and accounts of them. And the various, the problematic is that we've got no way to really decide between the various different accounts. And in that sense, it's at the cognitive or interpretational level or something like that. Whereas if you follow the Jains or the Nyayas, and I think even Husserl would perhaps, allow for this kind of thing, that there is something about perception that admits of this subjectivized, qualified, perspectival sort of qualification all the way down. So I don't know if I'm not sure if there's a question there. I'm just wondering if that's part of the debate somehow that maybe I've missed.
No, it's a great question, comment, thank you. So I have two responses, or kind of two thoughts come up. So one is Tsongkhapa is writing in a time where arguably perspectivalism has gone wild or something, where he wants to rein in, namely ethics, and his tradition gets called the virtuous way, and for him, really, ethics and karma are non-negotiable, and so there's a strong realist strand that flows through his works because of that, because he wants to ground ethics and arguably a metaphysical basis of ethics in being emptiness. That's a separate topic, but drawing from Shantideva and the fact that there is no real self, there is no real boundary between self and other, and suffering anywhere is suffering everywhere, and suffering is to be eliminated, and therefore compassion is the right attitude to take and conduct to act. But so karma is non-negotiable, it's not perspectival, and emptiness is not perspectival. So emptiness is also non-negotiable. So when analyzing the nature of things, if anything, it's not found. And this non-finding is the nature of things, ironically or paradoxically. And that's not perspectival for Tsongkhapa in that sense. I think perspectivalism is a problem that Daktsang raises in his critique of Tsongkhapa, that, so how do you account for perspectivalism and yet have a robust causal theory about the workings of karma and causal efficacy, because something's going to give, and that's really at the heart of this debate, between relativism in a pernicious form and absolutism as a realist form. And I think that relativism is not a problem. It's just when it's pernicious. So relativism, you can have subjects depend on objects, internal worlds depend on external worlds, and you can have this knowledge depends on knowers, and that's not a problem. It's just a problem when it becomes pernicious, when it becomes a license for anything goes, and then that's a problem because it's not entailed by its relativism. So that's one thing I wanted to say, but I think you put your finger right on one of the main issues that drives the critiques of Tsongkhapa. And the other issue is related to the debate that I started off with in the Candrakīrti's critique of Bhāviveka's interpretation of Nāgārjuna's first verse, of that things don't arise from themselves. Because a logical form that Dignaga put forward creates the necessity of a shared logical subject. So in order for two people to have a debate, and that was a big contribution that Dignaga made, that allowed Buddhists to respond to Nyaya critiques and to engage with Mimamsas and Jains. But so introducing this shared subjects is problematic. And even Bhāviveka was aware of this. So he said, why don't we just make a shared subject the mere sound? Because some non-Buddhists theorize sound as a quality of the ether. Vaisheshikas, it's a quality of the ether, but Buddhists, it's just a transformation of the elements. So if we theorize sound, if we take it as a logical substance of a linguistic entity, then we've already theorized it. So let's just take it as a perceptual entity, mere sound, without any theorization. But then Candrakīrti problematizes this notion of a pure perception, that things are directly and immediately accessed. Even this notion of a mere sound is always already theorized. We don't have access to unmediated sense data, so to say. It's mediated all the way down. We actually construct theories about sense data from our linguistic practices, from our theorization, rather than the other way around. And so I think why did I bring that up? I was going to bring that up related to the perspectivalism. But this lack of any shared linguistic quantities, or even lack of any shared perceptual quantity, and these are debated whether perceptual quantities are shared or not, but I think it doesn't hold up, at least for Daktsang. These even things that are shared perceptually doesn't hold up. So there is this radical perspectivalism. But for Tsongkhapa, there is an interest to block radical perspectivalism in the hopes to build a robust epistemology around conventional practices, to show why you should do good things and avoid bad things and follow the karma, the law of karma, because there was a lot of transgressive tantric practices, and he was really pushing monasticism, and arguing that it's very important that ethics are the foundation of meditative practice and are important. So I think that's also the heart of the debate, or part of the debate. One side of the debate is this relativism, perspectivalism. You can't. But does that mean anything goes if you take a radically perspectival view, or is there any other way to ground, a Buddhist truth from a non-Buddhist truth, or a truth that brings liberation from a truth that doesn't bring liberation? And then that's where you seem to need to appeal to something beyond just perspective. Well, my student thinks, I always get this from my students, it's like, well, it's all relative. It's, in a very, sophomoric sense. And then I'm like, no, it's, it's not that simple. That's not, that's not going to work for, your perspective on Dignaga, reading, 2 pages on Dignaga is not, yes, it is a perspective, but there can be nuanced perspectives. There can be more informed perspectives, and you're still in this perspectival structure, but can't there still be kind of qualitative dimensions to those perspectives? But you're right. That's a big part of this.
Just one little follow-up then. Does Tsongkhapa really end up being a kind of pragmatist to solve this issue?
That's an excellent question. And for me, I think Tsongkhapa is underdetermined. So he has a lot of very interesting things to say, raises a lot of interesting issues that get taken down different paths by his students. And there's a strong realist current that stems from his students. I don't see it across the board in his work. But I see a lot of pragmatist elements at play too, and certainly some of his students as well take on that. I think that current is there, but it's difficult to pin down, only because there's also moments where he does tend towards less pragmatic claims and more kind of seemingly realist ones. But I think there's good and bad moments, or kind of pragmatist and realist moments, and I think that's just part of this tension. It's like it goes back and forth. But thank you.
Yes, thank you. So, it's fascinating to see people engaging with these issues from different, so many different idioms and perspectives. And I have a question, but I don't, or another perspective shift, idiom shift, but I don't. But does anyone else have something that they want to bring up? I don't want to preempt any other comments or questions that might be hovering in the air there. Okay. Oh, Chris. Yes, Chris.
Hi, thanks a lot for that talk, Dr. Duckworth. I am wondering about, let's see, I might have to ask you to pull up the slide on Nāgārjuna. I'm wondering what your view is of that, the argument in verse 1.1, or your interpretation of the argument for against the claim that something can arise from other things. Because I mean, that seems like of the four options for how things might be caused, or one thing might be caused, the most obvious theory seems to be something's caused when it arises from other things, right? And then number 3 depends on the truth. It depends on the refutation of number 2, in part.
Right.
I'm wondering what your interpretation is of Nāgārjuna on that one.
Okay, can you see my screen? Do you see the? You don't see it. Did I not share it? Let's see. I thought I.
It was up and then it went down again.
Yes, there it is.
Now you see that? Okay, so is it there?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So yes, thank you. So I cited Candrakīrti, who says, well, first I should say, in Tibetan commentaries, at least, early Tibetan commentaries, maybe the first Tibetan, Makja Chalchup Sundu, but he says that not arising from self is a refutation of the Samkhyas, who believe that everything arises from this materiality or prakriti. And then not from others is some other Buddhist traditions that assert that cause and effect are discrete entities. Not from both is a Jain tradition, since the Jain tradition came up, kind of this, and then and not without cause the Charvakas, which are the materialists. So they just things happen and it's just nature, it's just there's no cause. So but going to the commentarial tradition, so what Candrakīrti says for why things don't arise from other, let me actually, I think it was this one. So if things arose from other, number 2. So you can use a parallel absurd consequence following from the same reason. So light arises from darkness. Why? Because it's other. So a peach arises from an apple seed. Why? Because it's other. So if otherness, if it is other and not connected in any way, other than its otherness, then it's, basically anything can arise from anything. And so that's an important part, as you mentioned, for the third, right? Because the third, if things are not arising from self nor from other, then you can't have it both ways. The conjunction is false as well. Did that?
Yeah, that answers my question. Thanks a lot.
And I think it's important to understand that this isn't a negation of necessarily of all causality, right? Because he negates things are arising causelessly, but it's a certain type of causality of discrete entities, theorized in a certain way, like a rich theoretical account of causality fails. And so then there's this appeal to the world, right? To the loka prasiddha, what is just renowned in the world, appeal to consensus. And people don't always talk, appeal to appeal to the way people talk. And this comes back to the previous comment or question about pragmatism or even use. Meaning is it's in its use. So what does it mean to be a cause, or what people call a cause? So people can say, I planted that tree, and all they did was just put a seed in the earth. They didn't do anything more than that. Or we can say, we don't always speak consistently, like, oh, that was me when I was 5, or, that's the same river that I swam in last year. It's not necessarily consistently when everything's different about that river or the water, or at least it's just a mere name or way of speaking. So causality too is just conceptually constructed, intersubjectively constituted way of talking about the world, and it lacks any intrinsic nature in itself. And if it did have intrinsic nature, it would arise in one of these 4 ways that seem to be exhaustive. And so that's also important, that there has to be it's not from self, other, both, or causeless. So these are, rather than a dilemma, it is or it is not. In Indian logic, there's these 4 alternatives, a tetralemma. Is not, is both, is neither. So it's an exhaustive account.
Thank you.
Thank you. So, other questions? Are you Douglas? Are you okay with continuing on until?
Yes, I'm happy to. I love to, get questions and talk about this stuff. So I'm happy to.
Great. Well, we're glad to have you captive here. Other questions that people have? Well, okay, so I'll jump in with my so we're all coming from slightly different idioms, as I said, that we're translating, and I'm coming from more of a Chan background, and you evoked that that Chan way of talking about these things, which is much more elusive and literary, that mountains are mountains, mountains are no longer mountains, mountains again are mountains, kind of dialectic. And so, trying to translate into a kind of idiom in between, because I don't, I am fascinated by by Prāsaṅgika, but I don't do it myself. Going back to your point about Nāgārjuna's, sort of the basis of this, that Prāsaṅgika is performative at root, that this anti-realism is what we do, and that propositional logic will always falter when it comes up against the way that we perform the lack of reality of the world as we think it, as we project it, as we grasp it. Chan deals with that in a slightly different way, but I believe it's the same point. It seems to be making the same point, that we can't, in a sense, we can't help but perform always the lack of reality of the world that as we think it is. The only difference is whether we realize that that's what we're doing or not. And there is also the concomitant ethical issue, like the antinomianism. Like, if all you need to do is realize that the world is not as you think it is, it's absurd, it would be lead to all these absurdities if it were, then this radical relativism would lead to ethical issues. And their way of dealing with it is what I'm hearing you say about Shantideva is similar, is that it's always co-performative. There's never, it's not solipsistic enactment of this lack of this anti-realism. So, and this is expressed in various koans like Baizhang's Fox. I don't know if you're familiar with that one. But there's still an ambiguity about whether or not the conscious awareness of performing lack of realism, or I mean anti-realism would actually be a false action also, because it would be reifying anti-realism. So is there an engagement with this? Is there a way to engage this performativity in the Tibetan mode, which is not linguistically based necessarily, but pinpoints a kind of perspective shift in which mountains are still mountains, but there is a way of engaging the shift to the shift that happens with recognition or realization, enlightenment. Is that question clear at all?
Yes, and yes and yes. Because I'm focusing on a very narrow area of Tibetan Buddhist practice and theory, in monasteries in particular, where they're studying a lot of text in a certain way, and debating these texts, and that's a really very small percentage of people that are invested in even amongst monastics, that take that approach to really read these texts and study them deeply. There's a lot of other performative dimensions of ritual enactments, and what really came to mind was the yogic tradition. So there's a strong pushback against this kind of scholarly or scholastic style that we could call, that I've presented today, in the sense of this yogic dimension, or what Jeffrey Samuels, he has a book called The Civilized Shamans. So the shamanic side of the civilization of Tibet. So Tibet is unique because both of these are interplay. And so what I've been looking at is more of what Tibetans will call the scholar's approach, or the pundit approach. But then there's another approach called the Kusulu's approach, and not the pundit, but kind of the beggar or the mendicant's approach, which is typically you find more of the rhetorical anti-intellectualism of study. So why waste your time, talking about these things? Why don't you just get along doing them? If you talk about performativity, where's the performance? Isn't that like a performative contradiction, that you're performing structure and systematicity while talking about performativity? But that tends to be the institutional mode, and I think the institutional mode preserves traditions, whereas the yogic and meditative tradition, enacts them. And it's nice to have a healthy dose of both. I think in the absence of either, there's a problem. Like this, the scholarly traditions tend to get too dry and stale when they're separated too far from the meditative and contemplative traditions. But then the meditative and contemplative traditions tend to, maybe die out with a few charismatic figures, or, are not preserved, beyond a few special isolated individuals and get lost too easily. And so I think this healthy tension and this pushback, right, of theory and practice, and what's more important, study or meditation or structure or anti-structure, what is more important, and what's the real, what is the Buddhist truth and path, and how does it unfold? And I think it's, drawing back to this issue of the hybridity and dialecticity, I think it's really in this in-between space that I liken it to like a battery. So you have like a positive and negative, or you could even say with negation and affirmation, and it's really the energy happens, in between those. So polarities tend to get stuck and static, but dynamism, has currents that run, between these polarities. So certainly tantric traditions are highly performative, aesthetic, both in the aesthetic, highly aestheticized ritual, symbolisms, ritual enactments of emptiness and the constructed nature of reality, mentally constructed nature of reality, in some way visualization practices like that allow and embody, or they're necessarily embodied, importantly embodied, and the body gets plays an important and irreducible role in these practices, as do the notions of identity, get creatively performed. So there's a whole lot of this performative dimension that happens in what is really the main form of Buddhist practice in Tibet, which is the tantric practices. And Tsongkhapa, just to tie it in with back to him, he was really trying to ground tantric practices kind of back in this rich theory to an extent, because there's a lot of kind of performativity run wild, and he wanted to rein it in a bit, or at least get people to not just enact the mountains being mountains and rivers are rivers before you went through the stage of studying Zen, not just to perform ordinariness in the unreflective way, but maybe ordinariness in a heightened way of naturalness and a sense of constructedness all the way down, and hybridity all across the field of the world. So he wanted a strong foundation in theory, and then after kind of understanding Prāsaṅgika-Madhyamaka, he saw that as the view of Tantra, Prāsaṅgika-Madhyamaka. And so, and importantly for him, it was not a different view. It's not a different view than the Tantric view, which is not always the case for other traditions, but certainly Tantra, yogic traditions that appeal to the unconstructed, the natural, the undeliberate, non-deliberate, and that they often make fun of the intellectuals, and their mode is often poetry and song, as a way to challenge, the form of logic and argument and debate. But so certainly, I think you're right that both in the form of Prāsaṅgika-Madhyamaka is a dialectical practice within the monastery, within a certain segment of the monastery, but there's another larger dialectical space between outside the monasteries and in the monasteries. And I think there's levels of this performative enactments that happen all over the place. But I just in some ways it's easier to do scholarship or publish books on the material that is more accessible, or at least what I've tried to do is try to render and try to understand a little bit about Buddhist thought and practice, and try to make it available to people that might have an interest in these philosophical dimensions too, but aren't familiar with these worlds beyond Anglo-American or European continental philosophy. So kind of open it, globalize the conversation a bit.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and I do appreciate that, and find that in your book to be the case, that it really opens. I appreciate that you put things in ways that can speak to people from different fields, different discourses, and make the Tibetan debates relevant as to various domains, as has been kind of demonstrated in the questions that have come out from different perspectives in our audience here. And just to teaser for tomorrow night, so Douglas will be talking about his book and some of these issues that will be accessible for global philosophers. So, other questions, other comments come up. So we've kept Douglas for 2 hours now, and and I know it's getting late on the East Coast where you are, so we should let you go. Please do join us tomorrow night. We have if you need registration links for tomorrow night, email myself or Courtney, or put something in the chat, and we'll make sure that you get a link. And so this is part 1, and hope that you'll be able to join us for part 2 tomorrow night. And I want to thank Douglas for really giving us such a rigorous, interesting, and detailed engagement with these issues. So thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you everyone for bearing with me. I find these topics like Prāsaṅgika and pramāṇa, or epistemology, the most difficult topics in Tibetan Buddhism. But since this book is coming out, I thought I would want to share with you this current research. So thank you for bearing with me and for your excellent questions and attention.
Thank you so much. So I'm going to hang out for a minute good. To send links, but someone else already did that, so that's good. But I'll hang out for any questions, and we'll hope to see you tomorrow night. Bye. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Douglas. That was really
Bye.
interesting.
Thank you so much.